Hey, welcome everybody to Hope for Our Times. And let me tell you, we have quite the program for you today. And I believe this is the first time I have my guest on this program today. He's spoken with me at our conferences before and at 412 Church. But today at Hope for Our Times, this is terrific. We're going to be talking about propaganda, psychological warfare, psyops, whatever you want to call them, fifth generation warfare used to manipulate the masses, and a whole lot more. My guest today is Bill Federer, and he is renowned speaker, author, and president of AmeriSearch Incorporated, dedicated to researching America's noble heritage. His daily radio segment, American Minute, is broadcast daily across America and over the internet. His Faith in History television program airs on the TCT network on stations across America via DirecTV. And his debut book, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, has sold over 500,000 copies. He's authored several other books cited by various professionals and in legal cases. He's also a native of St. Louis, Missouri, and he studied at the University of Dallas and holds a business degree from St. Louis University. His career spans real estate, the oil and gas industry, has worked with faith-based groups. Bill, this is wonderful having you join me. Thank you so much. This is great.
Hey, Tom, great to be with you.
Man, this is so cool. I didn't know you were in oil and gas and real estate before this. I didn't know that. I bet you have a lot to say.
Yeah, that was my dad had a real estate company. My granddad had a real estate company, built like 40 subdivisions in St. Louis. And both my dad and granddad were presidents of the St. Louis Board of Realtors. So we sort of grew up managing apartments and all the stuff that comes with that. That was my summers, was painting apartments. And then my degree was in accounting. And so I worked for Santa Fe Industries. They used to own the Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad based out of Tulsa, and would audit pipeline companies and all that kind of stuff. And then got into ministry work. So,
well, this is great. Really a blessing to have you on. You've been on CNN, you've been on Fox News, you've been all over the place, and now you're here, Hope for Our Times. And I have so many questions to ask you. We're going to get into fifth generation warfare, psyops. I'm going to get your opinion, just your opinion. I understand. I think all of our viewers will understand that. But I think you have an opinion on what happened in Lahaina. But if you want to say anything there, certainly the Francis Scott Key Bridge. I'm curious as to your thoughts on that. And again, as I mentioned, psyops. But before we even go there, you have spoken so much on America, America's history, socialism. In fact, one of my favorite books, in fact, it is my favorite book when it comes to putting together the understanding of socialism and where we are in America, is one of your books that you have. You have several books, and everything you write is just outstanding. But I've been blessed by them. But I'm going to ask you, I'm going to go here first, because this really, it speaks volumes to what's been going on within the church over the last several years, and then just in society in general. But it's Romans chapter 13. And you came and did a message for me one Sunday, and you talked about Romans chapter 13. In fact, it was just an added bonus at the end of your sermon that you gave. And Romans chapter 13 is a passage that's used by people to say, hey, you're supposed to submit to the governments because government has been appointed to God. Therefore, you just be obedient. Whatever they tell you to do, you just go for it. Can you give us an understanding of what Romans 13 is before we get through the psyops and before we get to fifth generation warfare and these other things?
Sure. Romans 13:1 says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. So, in a monarchy, a king has subjects, and the subjects submit to the king. A republic has citizens, and the citizens are the king. The word citizen means co-king, co-ruler, co-sovereign. So Romans 13 is understood differently in a monarchy versus a republic. And subjects obey, citizens give consent. And so, big picture, the most common form of government in world history is kings. From the beginning of recorded history, Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesars, Kaisers, Sultans are, it's basically a gang structure. So that's the default setting for human government is gangs. We got rid of all the laws. What would happen? It'd be fine for a couple of days, and then people start robbing and killing and emptying the stores and then going house to house and squatting, right? And taking over houses. And then we would get our neighborhood together to protect ourselves. And we'd find somebody that knew how to fight a little bit better than the rest. And we would say, you be our captain. And he would be like the good gang leader. And then the ones that are robbing, they would have their worst guy, and he'd be the bad gang leader. And we'd be back to gangs. And as the centuries would go on, they would gain more weapons and become what we would call kings. And it's a hierarchical system. If you're friends with the king, you're more equal. You're not friends with the king, you're less equal. You're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason, or you're a slave. And so these kingdoms will get bigger. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, until finally the King of England had the biggest empire on the planet. He was a globalist. He was a one world government guy. The sun never set on the British Empire. India, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, British Guyana, Canada, Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, and America. And America's founders decided they didn't like a king telling us what to do, so they broke away and flipped it and made the people the king. So the question I ask is, well, where did America's founders get these ideas? From the New England pastors. Where did they get their idea? From the Reformation, from the Bible. What part of the Bible? That first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul. Lo and behold, around 1400 BC, Israel comes out of Egypt, millions of the Israelites, and for 400 years, there's no king. It is the first instance in all of recorded history of millions of people and no king. And it worked because every single citizen was taught the law, and they were personally accountable to God to follow the law. And so this period is called the Hebrew Republic, and it was studied by the founders in America so much that they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. But if we look at Israel's republic, what happened to it? Well, eventually the priests stopped teaching the law. You think, what? Yeah, here's Eli, the high priest. His own sons are sleeping with women in the tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And then you have another Levite with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. And you're reading the story in the book of Judges, and the tribe of Dan comes along and steals the graven image and tells this Levite, come along with us and you can be a priest to our whole tribe with this graven image. And you're scratching your head saying, isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have those. And then the terrible story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with the woman he's not even married to. He's not following the law. And they're traveling in a house, and a house gets surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the last stages of a people ruling themselves, this casting off of self-restraint. They rape the poor girl to death. By the time you're grossed out, you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priests stopped teaching what was right in the Lord's eyes. So they all go to Samuel the prophet, and they say, this self-government system's not working. We want to be like the other countries. We want a king. And they do, and they get King Saul. And the Lord tells Samuel, they did not reject you, they rejected me. Now, why is this story important? Because the kings of Europe look to the Bible for their authority, their Romans 13 authority. But they look to the King Saul and on part of the Bible. The Calvinist Puritans and the Baptists and the Presbyterians and the Quakers that founded America, they look to the pre-King Saul period of the Bible. 400 years, millions of people, and no king. And it worked because everybody was taught the law and personally accountable to God to follow it. So King Saul is the divider between England and America, right? So the people that want you to submit to the king and just blindly obey, they like King Saul. The people that say, no, we're the king, they like the pre-King Saul period, right? And so what happened with Israel? Well, whenever you get a king, he turns into a tyrant. So what happened? Saul's pouting that his son, Jonathan, became friends with David, and he turns to his soldiers, and he goes, you soldiers don't care about me. And one says, Doeg the Edomite, I saw David go to this town, and the priest gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath. And Saul said, bring those priests to me. They show up. He turns to his soldiers and says, kill them. The soldiers hesitate, and Doeg the Edomite goes out and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system. where every individual is accountable to God to follow the law. And the law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn somebody to death. There's only one witness, this Doeg guy, and they're hesitating. They still have a conscience. And Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you, the government. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. Tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. Tell me there's no more male and female. Fine. You blow your trumpets, I'll bow to your statue like Nebuchadnezzar. The tyrant government always wants to dictate beliefs. And God is jealous. He doesn't want the government between you and him. And so the people that say, just submit to the government blindly, they like the King Saul. They like the Doeg. They like you just surrender your conscience to the government. If the government tells you to kill Jews, kill them. Whereas the pre-King Saul period, they still have a conscience. They're like, no, I'm accountable to God to follow the law. And so why would God tell you to do something in his law and then tell you to submit to a government that tells you not to do what he just got done telling you to do?
That is a great way of putting it. Yeah, we have God's law, live by his law, and then he tells you not to. It doesn't make any sense. I love how you work that all together. Pre-King Saul and post-King Saul. Which government do we want? And we see this happening within churches. There's many pastors we've seen over the past 4 years, and they've been saying, hey, you just got to go along with the government. And I've had that conversation many times. It's been very strange to have that conversation. But I'm going to ask you about some more things. You mentioned also while you were talking, when you look at the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, what happened there, or the book of Judges is what you're referring to specifically, when you have the angels, and we have the whole dynamic with the men when they rape the concubine and all that different stuff that goes on. Time of Judges. We see that, and you said, this is what happens when you look at a kingdom that is in its last stages. And we look at where we are in America. We've gone to this place of the whole gender ideology, whatever you want to call it. I don't even know what you want to call it. It's gone from homosexuality to homosexual marriage, and then it's gone to this transgender stuff. We have bestiality thrown in there now. We have pedophilia that is now being promoted as being, hey, this is something that's also to be celebrated, which many people warned about, that this is going to end up going this direction. It used to be Gay Pride Day, then it became Gay Pride Month, and now it's just Pride Month. You know, it's interesting, the way things are conveyed to the public keeps changing, but the progression of sin just keeps getting worse and worse. Where do you think we are, your opinion of where we are in this timeline when you look at it with the history past, the biblical history past, just before a nation is finished, and where we are right now?
Lust is never appeased by yielding to it. It always wants more. The more you yield to it, the more it gets. It's like a fire. You feed the fire, it gets hotter. And so what we're facing is a lust-driven agenda. The people on the other side are driven by lust. And the more you cave and give into them, the more they want, until they want your kids. They want you to be happy giving them your kids. They want you to call you hateful if you're not happy giving them your kids. And what's next? Cannibalism? I mean, there's no bottom to it. And anyway, so a study was done in the 1930s by a guy named J.D. Unwin, U-N-W-I-N. He's an Oxford anthropologist, and he wrote a book called Sex and Culture. And he studied 80 major civilizations over 5,000 years of history, and he saw trends. And one of the trends he observed was that sexual promiscuity always precedes the collapse of a civilization. Greeks, Romans, Babylonians, Assyrians, it never had. And so it's civilizations go through a life cycle. And like a plant goes through a seed, then a seedling, and then it grows and it matures and it's bearing fruit, and then it gets rotten and starts to die. And so the life cycle of a civilization, J.D. Unwin points out 4 stages. First is a period of pain and poverty. They go through war, they go through famine, and they make it through. And then they work hard and they become productive. And then they work together and they become patriotic. And then finally, they get prosperous. And then they want to enjoy their prosperity and they get promiscuous. It's sort of like a athlete when he's young, he's focused and disciplined, watches his diet, exercises. He wants that championship. And then finally he gets it and he is the champ for a couple seasons. And then he gets a little lazy and eats fatty foods and stays up all night and parties. And in his mind, he still thinks he's the champ, but in reality, he's a hot-bellied couch potato, and he gets called into the ring of competition and he gets the tar knocked out of him. So these civilizations, they go through this pain and poverty. They go through working together and becoming productive, and then they become patriotic, and then prosperous, and then promiscuous. J.D. Unwin even called it a sexual marketplace. He says when women as a group say nothing happens unless there's a commitment, the guys make the commitment and work hard to provide for their wives. And then something appears, children. And then the man has another emotion called being protective of his wife and children. And when all the men of the country are productive and protective, rising water floats all boats. The whole country becomes productive, protective, creative, innovative, expansionistic, even militaristic. But when the women as a group say there does not need to be a commitment, well, guess what? Water seeks its own level. You have a bunch of guys saying, hey, party time. They're going to get selfish and focus on their own pleasures, and they're going to be less responsible, and there's going to be fewer kids born to fill the ranks of the military. And the ones that are born are going to be undisciplined. And when enough of the men of the country act this way, it gets weakened and they get conquered. And so that's why we see this pushing of a feminism and LGBTQ and trans stuff in the military. It's just weakening the military. I mean, other countries are not afraid of a bunch of guys wearing skirts.
That's a great way of putting it. I mean, and it's a sad indictment against America. I believe it's done intentionally, which I want to come to in just a second, because I want to ask you about PSYOPs, fifth generation warfare, what you see coming with the American election, how well the things you talk about are received or not received. We're going to get into all those in just a second. But first of all, everybody, I want to let you know if you're going to be in the Lake Stevens area of Washington, it's up there near Seattle. I will be there May 3 and 4 with Dr. Billy Crone, Pablo Forsini, and Eric Barger. Join us if you can. You can go to the website, hopeforourtimes.com. Check it out. Would love to meet you up there. It's Friday and Saturday, and I believe also Sunday. So I'd love to meet you if you're in the area. Lake Stevens, check it out up there near Seattle, Washington. Go to the hopeforourtimes.com webpage. Also, we have a Footsteps of the Apostle Paul. It's a tour coming up. It is an education tour. Bill, I think this is something you would love to go on if you could. If I can swing it, I'll bring you along. I have my friend, Pastor Bob Probert. He co-hosts with me. And we're going to go to Ephesus, Patmos, Athens, Greece. We're going to talk about Plato and all the different philosophers. We're going to hit Mars Hill. We're going to go to Corinth. And it's just going to be an absolutely terrific time. We also have a Rome extension for anybody who wants to go. But that's coming up in September, folks. If you want to go, it is like one of those once-in-a-lifetime things. But it is an education tour. So you'll have free time. You're going to have a really good time. You'll be with like-minded people, and you're going to get your faith is going to be strengthened. It's kind of like going to Israel, but it's a different one. It's more along the lines of the Apostle Paul and much of the New Testament. I think I know you'll be blessed. I've done this before and led this tour before. But Bill, that sounds like fun, doesn't it?
It sounds like a lot of fun. Yeah.
Have you been on one of those yet?
I have not been to Turkey.
I have. Boy, I would love to get you on one.
I've been to one part of Turkey, like Gaziantep, but not to where all of the early 7 churches in the Book of Revelation were, and Ephesus, and I'd love to see those places.
Yeah, Ephesus is off the charts. Boy, maybe I can get you on one of these. I would love to have you come with me. Man, you would love it. It would be great. The people would love it. It'd be fantastic having you. All right. So I better get going because I'll start talking about that for an hour. Okay. Bill, you've talked about psychological warfare, 5th generation warfare. I mean, I think even in my circle, Bible prophecy and so forth, there's even psyops that are done in here. I think there's so many different dynamics. People are easily distracted, yet there's real things that really are going on. I have my concerns about weather manipulation energy-directed weapons, all these different things. I look what happened in Maui. I mean, we don't have any answers. We look at what happened with all these cattle in Texas and the fires. Now we're finding out about bird flus or everybody's going to die. We see the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Can you walk us through, because you've written about this, you've talked about this, fifth generation warfare and psychological warfare and manipulation of the masses. Try to talk about it without getting me censored, though. So bless your heart.
Yeah. So the Bible has stories of the spies going into the promised land, and 10 of them come back with a negative report. There's giants in the land. We can't go in. And it spreads. And all the people say, let's stone Moses and go back to Egypt. And God is so upset. He strikes those 10 spies dead on the spot, and he orders the other ones to wander for 40 years. And Joshua and Caleb get to go into the promised land. So it's like, what happened? The Israelites were defeated in their mind. They didn't even get a chance to fight to go into the promised land. They were defeated in their mind. And then you flip it around the other way. Gideon, there's 100,000 Midianites coming in. He gets 30,000 Israelites. God said too many, whittles it down to 10,000 because it tells everybody they're scared to go home. Still too many, go drink from a creek, whittles it down to 300. And then God rolls up his sleeve and says, watch this. And he has them break into these three groups. They surround this huge Midianite camp. And at the right signal, they smash the clay pots, they hold up their torches, they blow their trumpets, and the Midianites jump up in the middle of the night in the dark, and they're bumping into each other, pulling out their sword and fighting and killing each other, and they're defeated in their mind. While Gideon and his men are just standing there blowing their trumpets. And so this idea of psychological warfare, there was a guy named Karl von Clausewitz, and he is a 19th century military strategist. And he gave the classic definition of war. The purpose of war is to force your opponent to submit to your will. You're going through all of this effort, weapons, military strategy. Why? Because you want to get your opponent to submit to your will. Well, gee, what if you could just get them to submit to your will without fighting? And so Sun Tzu's Art of War, written 5th century BC, he's giving all this advice, always get the upper ground and never fight a battle in front of a river, because if you're losing, it makes it hard to run away, and make yourself appear stronger, know your enemy and know yourself and all this. But then he says supreme excellence in a commander consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. In other words, if you're a really good general, you'll be able to win without even a fight. You'll psych them out. You'll defeat them in their brain. And now it's called 5th generation warfare, where you get your enemy to submit without them even waking up and realizing that they're in a war. If the goal is to get them to submit, why don't you just put them into a fear situation where they submit without even realizing that they're in a war? And so this psychological warfare, or short is PSYOPs, or cognitive warfare, we did some of it during World War II with airplanes dropping pamphlets down on the German villages saying, your side is already lost. Your commander just hasn't told you. And so these guys are going out to the fight and they're like, I heard we already lost. And they would dishearten them. And the Japanese did it to us with Tokyo Rose. This woman who's Japanese, spoke English, and had a very seductive voice, and the radio waves would go all across the ocean to our ships and military bases, and she would say, you Americans are bad, you're doing terrible things, and it would try to dishearten our guys. And so this idea is the battle for the mind. We saw it in the Bible where the Assyrians come to the walls of Jerusalem and yell in the Hebrew language, and the ambassadors say, no, we understand Assyrian, speaking the Assyrian language. They go, no, we want everybody in the walls to hear. You're going to do this, that, the other, you're going to, and so the battle is for the mind. Now, we can't talk about that without talk about marketing. You say marketing? Yeah, but marketing is trying to convince people in their mind to buy a product. So you're sharpening your tools on how to sway people's minds through marketing. So in the 1800s, it was Sears Catalog and Wells Fargo Wagon, and they would list everything about a Singer sewing machine. And you would make an informed purchase. But then in the early 1900s, you had a guy named Edward Bernays. the nephew of Sigmund Freud, that psychoanalyst, that discovered that we are social creatures. We like being accepted. We do not like being rejected. And so Edward Bernays said, look, you don't have to say anything about a product. You just make it look like everybody is using it. And then people will feel this pressure in order to be accepted. They will want to use it too. One is Crisco. Nobody knew what was in Crisco. Yet they had such a good marketing campaign with these magazine pictures with happy families. It looks like everybody's using it, that it put out of business the lard industry. Do you know what's in Crisco? Lard. Cottonseed oil. So in the deep South, they'd harvest cotton, and they'd have these mountains of black seeds that they would mush into this black mucky oil that they would use in factories and machinery. Nobody ate that stuff, called industrial seed oil. Well, somebody had the idea of bleaching it, put it in these containers, and we've all eaten it. And so you go from knowing everything about a Singer sewing machine to nothing about Crisco, but people are eating it. And then Edward Bernays talked about women's shoes. He says women go into a department store and think they're picking out shoes. They're not. The shoes were picked out for them by the marketing executive who paid the actors to put them on, who paid the photographer to take the pictures, who paid the magazines to print the ads, and the women see it in the magazines and want to buy it. And he goes, in this way, women are controlled in this part of their private lives by this marketing company. And so we're a country that's government from the consent of the governed. But Edward Bernays wrote a book called The Engineering of Consent. So if we're a government from the consent of the government, what if you could manipulate what the people know? So he says manipulation of the opinion of the masses is an important element in democrat society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism constitute an invisible government, which is the true power ruling the country. And so this idea is you can get control of media and education and television, and you can begin to manipulate it. We saw some of this during the Spanish-American War with yellow press. And William Hearst with his New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer with the Pulitzer Prize. And the country wasn't wanting to get into the Spanish-American War, but they would print their news articles on newspaper that was inexpensive, so it would turn yellow after a couple of days. So they called it yellow press journalism. And Hearst sent the artist Frederick Remington to Cuba and said, you provide the pictures and I'll provide the war. And so the media began to flex its muscles and realize we have the ability. Now, the Cubans were treated terrible by Spain, and they were being starved to death. So we needed to get involved and free them. But the point I'm making is that there's an effort by the media to sway the country. This is also in the Bible. Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and they're praising him as the Messiah, putting down palm branches on Palm Sunday. And but then 4 days later, Jesus is before Pilate. And Pilate says he didn't do anything wrong and washes his hands, but the Pharisees, the priests, go amongst the crowd and gets them to call out for Barabbas. So here you take a multitude of the people manipulated by a minority of these priests to call for Jesus to be killed. And so the idea of manipulating the masses has been perfected so much. And I can get into more. The Greeks were the first country after Israel to have lots of people and no king. If there's a king and you have an agenda, you got to get in to see the king. Like in China, they would have to bribe the Mandarin eunuchs to be able to get in to see they'd keep the harem, and they would arrange for you to see the emperor. But in Athens, there was no emperor. So if you have an agenda, how do you get in to see him? And that's when the Greeks invented theater. And they get the whole city together in this amphitheater. And I saw pictures of the ruins of those in Ephesus. But this amphitheater, you get the whole city together, and you would put on plays, comedies, tragedies, satires, where they would ridicule and buffoon certain points of view and honor and extol other points of view. And you'd leave the theater saying, I don't want to be like that poor guy who was made fun of. And then this other guy, he died so nobly, I want to be remembered like him. And so you would sway the masses of the Athenians through the theater. So from that time till now, theater, media, Hollywood is always political. in a country where it's the people that are the king, that are ruling it. And so this idea of manipulating, we saw during the Cold War. So some of the Soviets wanted to conquer the West with tanks, and a guy named Antonio Gramsci said, no, you got to rot the West from within. You can't defeat it on the battlefield. And he came up with a long march through the institutions where you would infiltrate the schools, the universities, the media, the churches, and you'd bring this socialist ideology in. And then once the country's weakened, then you can defeat it.
That's where we are now. Where we look, I was watching an interview, it was with Yuri Bezmenov, Soviet defector. The interview was probably 40 years old. In fact, I think I showed it at something that you spoke at one time. And he basically described how the Soviets would take over. And it was through this type of manipulation of the masses, and how this has already happened in America. Again, his interview was 40 years ago. He goes, America's already done as far as that goes. But I mean, look at where we are now. Well, what's happening in universities, churches, as you mentioned. That's why we have so many pastors that go along with these things. But then if we look at just some of the events right now, well, we look at, I would call it conditioning for what's coming, the marking of the masses, the people willing to go along with this system that's coming, the transgenderism and all of the madness that everybody knows is wrong, the gaslighting. It was just a couple weeks ago, Biden, we have the proclamation of Resurrection Sunday is now going to be Transgender Day. We have that. And then you go, and then a few days later he says, I never said that. Well, we have it in writing. You did say that. The gaslighting that's taking place and all of these things. So we have that, and then we see these strange things happen. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on it, because I know you've thought about it. The fires in Maui, we don't get any answers out of. I mean, there's so many strange things that happen there. With the cattle that have been destroyed by this, from what I understand, the largest fire in the history of Texas, recorded fire. All these cattle that are destroyed, that is going to affect the food supply. We have the Francis Scott Key Bridge. There's so many unanswered questions. So many things seem strange. So on the one hand, we're dealing with psyops, fifth generation warfare, and then you have this other dynamic that we look at and we go, what's really going on? What are some of your observations with these things?
During the World War II, I wrote a whole book on FDR. And during World War II, he talked about the dangers of the Nazis infiltrating our country and destroying our infrastructure, bridges, railroads, food supplies. It's like, here he was, and we're seeing it happen. And I think they're doing it intentionally. And because we don't know this history, we're letting it get a free ride. I think a lot of it's an inside job. I mean, you think of it, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, they control trillions of dollars, and they have bought up the food supplying companies. And a lot of the fires and things that happen, it's like, it looks like somebody was given a pass to go in there and do this. The recent Francis Scott Key Bridge, I read, where the black box that controls, that records what's going on in the pilot's cabin there on this ship. That the 2 minutes before the collision, it was erased. Another I read, where Apostleship of the Seas is a Catholic ministry that goes to these ships and takes all the sailors to the Walmart, and they can buy toiletries. And then reportedly, some of them went to a bar and had a good time. And meanwhile, nobody's on the ship. It's like, okay, anybody could have had access to the ship. And then Obama did a Netflix movie on cyber warfare, and it had ocean-going container ships having their navigation hacked by cyber attacks, and these ships being steered and crashing into things. It's like, oh, okay. And then the ships have double backup. So their entire power supply, their entire navigation systems, for maritime law, they have to have two backups, like airplanes. They have to have completely different systems. So if one, the electricity goes off completely, the other one's still functional. To have both of them go off is too strange of a coincidence. And then you realize that Baltimore is the largest seaport for America on the eastern coast. And all of the oil and supplies, and then that particular bridge blocks the going in and out. And if there was an enemy and they did want to weaken us from the inside, and you're that interview with Yuri Bezmenov, he talks about the four stages of taking over a country. And first it was this infiltration stage. And he says, people think of KGB like James Bond. He goes, no, it's not that sexy. He says that he was a KGB guy. He says, just go in and you just simply observe groups and you study groups and you find out which ones feel like they're the oppressed and which ones you could classify as oppressors, haves and have-nots. And there were religiously Bosnians, Sunni Shia Orthodox, ethnically the Bosnians, the Croats, the Serbs, economically the proletariat versus the bourgeois, the religiously, the racial, it doesn't matter. You would pit them against each other. And then when you would have some incident, and he says this first stage takes years, maybe 20 years of infiltration into these groups. Then the second stage is you have some incident that you can fan into a flame and get the whole country into panic. And then you weaken the infrastructure and cause the country to get in debt. And then you do your coup or your rigged election and you replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And then you have normalization stage where you pretend like everything goes back to normal, but the people have lost all their freedoms. And so we've seen this weakening of the instrument. We're the most in-debt nation in the history of the world. And one of the things I've studied is the rise and fall of empires, and debt is always a precursor to the collapse of a civilization, right? The Romans, as long as they were conquering, they could live off the wealth of the conquered peoples. But once Hadrian built his wall this far and no further, they didn't get any more of that, yet they were used to living high on the hog, and they got in debt. And then the Ottoman Empire, as long as it was conquering, it was living off of other conquered peoples. But then once it was stopped, it began to tax the Christians. And then when there was fewer and fewer Christians, their tax base to Spain. Spain was getting gold from the New World. As long as that gold kept coming, then they were spending it as fast as they got it. But then when it didn't come anymore, they kept spending and they got in debt. And their Spanish Armada got sunk. They rebuilt it. It got sunk with the hurricane. Then rebuilt it again. It got sunk. And so Spain went bankrupt. And you look at the British Empire. It was the biggest empire in the world. But then it expanded and it couldn't maintain all the armies and everything, and it got in debt. How did we defeat the Soviet Union under Reagan? It's called the arms race. And so Reagan spent on upgrading our military and space capabilities, and the Russia tried to keep up. And they were taking all the money that should have gone into their GDP and their businesses and jobs and infrastructure, and they were spending it on military. And they couldn't keep up, and the Soviet Union collapsed through debt. So we are doing to ourselves voluntarily what we did to collapse the Soviet Union, right? We forced them to go into debt, and here we are in debt. So these are, and Deuteronomy 28 has blessings and cursings. And one of the curses is that if you don't hearken to the voice of the Lord, the stranger will come in amongst you and rise up above you. And they will be the head and you'll be the tail. They'll be above and you'll be beneath. They will lend it to you and you will have to borrow. So having to borrow, right? We're borrowing money from China to pay for a war in Ukraine. Having to borrow means that you're a servant. Even Ben Franklin said that, the borrower is servant of the lender.
Borrower, servant to the lender, that's right. When I look at the southern border of America, I cannot help but think we have the enemy within the government, within virtually all the institutions. The enemy is here. I mean, you can't, the printing of money, these people at the top are pretty smart people. Doesn't mean they have good common sense. But anybody smart enough to realize this is a massive problem that's being created. To me, it appears intentional. I believe the Bible even paints a picture of what's coming in the near future as an intentional collapse of the economy, according to the book of Revelation. You look at the border of the southern border of the United States. There are people that are making the decisions to let these people come over illegally. Doesn't matter if they're Mexican, if they're Central America, South America, just overwhelming the system. But then we have Somalis and Muslims and Chinese nationals. We have men of military age that are coming over. And I cannot help but think, as you start looking at every aspect of society, something really strange is going on. We have the enemy within. So my mind automatically gets suspicious when I see what happened in Texas, when I see what happened in Maui, which we don't have any answers for, when we see what the Francis Scott Key Bridge, you start looking at everything and you go, I smell a rat. And I personally believe the rat is in Washington and is in all the media outlets and on down the list. But what do you make of the southern border, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, well, the Roman Empire, China, in the 2nd century AD, began to build large sections of the Great Wall of China. And the Huns could no longer attack into China as easily, so they turned west. And it started a domino effect of displaced tribes across Central Asia. And one tribe would pick up and move further west and hit another tribe, which would pick up and move further west. And so across the Roman border came the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Anglos and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Lombards and the Berbers. And Rome was being invaded by illegal immigrants. And at first they came slow, and they would assimilate and learn the Latin language and get involved and work, and they would even become military officers and even generals, and they'd get adopted into the Roman families. But then they came so fast, they kept their own language. One time the Rhine River froze, and a bunch of Visigoths come across, and the spring, the river thawed, and there were no Romans to drive them out. The Romans only armed the military, that they didn't want to trust the common people with weapons, because if they trusted the people with too many weapons, then the people could overthrow the government. So just the military had it. And well, the military was highly trained, but it was limited in size. And so when all these illegals began to come over, they had their military stretched around. They couldn't stop all the fires. And so Attila the Hun finally comes across, and he's literally wiping out cities across Europe. He's headed toward Paris. And a young woman named Genevieve gets all of Paris to fast and pray. And for some reason, Attila skips sacking Paris. Attila goes down to the Adriatic, and there is a huge city there, like Aeolia was the name. It was like the 9th biggest city in Europe. And Attila builds a throne, and he sits on it while he watches the entire city get burned. And so the people run out into the shallow, swampy water and hammer logs down into the sand. And they lived on platforms that they would go to one to another on boats with long sticks. And it grew into the city of Venice. Venice came about because Attila the Hun was wiping out cities. And then Attila was going to go and conquer Rome. Pope Leo came out and talked him out of it. Catholics say that he saw an angel above Pope Leo's head and he turned. But all it did was buy Rome 20 years, because in 476 AD, the Visigoths came in and they did sack Rome. And so you see that that it's like the breaking of a dam, comes across a little bit more. I liken it to weather patterns. You have a low pressure area and a high pressure area, and the high pressure always wants to rush to where the low pressure is, and vice versa. And then and so wherever you have any civilization that's successful, it's going to want to attract immigrants and people to it, right? Makes sense. But then if they show weakness, they attract faster and faster and faster until that overruns and that civilization collapses. And then somewhere else in the world, another civilization starts to rise and follows that pattern. But so as far as our southern border goes, I do think it's intentional. Prior to 1965, most immigrants in America came from Europe. They came from Germany, Ireland, England, Italy, and Eastern Europe, and they had a work ethic where it was a social stigma to receive welfare. And it was considered you'd be admitting a moral failure if you were known to be accepting welfare and your neighbors found out about it. And so Lyndon Johnson realized that as these Europeans came over and worked hard, they voted for candidates that would take away as little as possible in taxes. And but he noticed that immigrants from the real poor countries, the third world countries, didn't have that social stigma. And so Lyndon Johnson, Teddy Kennedy changed the immigration so that more came in from third world countries. They immediately signed them up for the Great Society welfare state. And once they got receiving money from the government, they tended to want to keep it coming. I mean, and so you basically build a permanent Democrat voter base. So right now, these immigrants coming across already, the federal government is helping them to sign up to vote. You say, well, they're illegal. They can't vote. I was in Texas speaking at an event. Louis Gohmert came to the event. I was very impressed. But the lady organizing it said that she's asked all throughout the Texas government, when somebody gets a driver's license and they check the citizen box, does anybody in the government actually check to see if they are a citizen? She said, nobody. She said, nobody in the government. She said, it's the honor system. So in other words, anybody can come across, get a driver, check citizen, then they can take it and go in and vote. And so we're seeing that if every person coming across the southern border was going to be a Republican voter, I think the Democrats would shut it down overnight. And they are specifically trying to limit immigrants from like Romania and Cuba. Why? Because they have a fresh taste of communism and they tend to not want to go back to that. And so they tend to not buy into the Democrat agenda. So, but the other ones, now, prior to Lyndon Johnson's welfare state, every immigrant was a net plus. There was no welfare to sign up for. The welfare was their relatives and churches. And so there was no minimum wage. There were no unions. So anybody could go down to the port and hire somebody and they could do a job for very cheap. They would live with their family. They would pool their money. And after a generation, they would buy a store or a shop or a farm and they would move up the ladder. And then they would go down to the port and hire somebody from another country that was poor, but they would learn the language and learn a skill. And so, but once you came up with the Lyndon Johnson welfare state, that every immigrant immediately, and then you have groups like the Catholic Charities and the Lutheran Charities that are getting billions of dollars from the government to do what? To sign up immigrants for welfare programs and make them burdens on local communities. And I was in Michigan going around the Capitol and meeting congressmen and the state reps. And then the person that was bringing me through said, they're saying, please stop all these illegals from coming in. And they said the Catholic Bishops Association would come in right after them and say, keep it coming. Why? Because they got paid for these NGOs and these different non-governmental money. They find a way of funneling money to them in the billions of dollars. And but they become permanent. They were bringing people from the Congo into Helena, Montana. It's like they don't know the language, they don't know the skill. Why are they bringing them in? And I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and so all these ladies working around with burqas. And I was in Bemidji, Minnesota, and the whole downtown is people with burqas. And it's like, why are they doing that? They want to, number one, have them become voters. Number two, if I don't know, am I running out of time? I don't want to.
No, I want to hear. I want to hear what number two is. What is it?
So if crime goes up in the city, some people feel unsafe and move out. Who? Well, usually people with families. Okay, pro-family people move out. And when crime goes up in the city and your store windows are getting smashed and the police are being ordered to stand down, well, your small business owners are going to move out. So pro-family, small pro-business, they're usually a higher percentage Republican. Who's left in the city? More people that are on government welfare and entitlements. Well, they tend to be a higher percentage Democrat. So if you have crime go up in the city, you change it so the Democrats get a monopoly control of city politics. And in election years, whoever wins the big city ends up winning the entire state.
Interesting. That's why.
And whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes, and the president's elected by electoral votes.
Hence why you have someplace like where I live in California, all the pro-family, pro-life people are leaving California and going to the other states where they are pro-family and pro-life and these things. So what's becoming here in California is more and more, it's getting more and more left. And that's a perfect, yeah, go ahead.
And the people that leave, their names stay on the voter rolls so they can do voter fraud.
Imagine that. One last question. I know we went a little bit over. One last question. The election in November, what are your thoughts? Do you think it's going to happen, or just curious?
Well, I ran for Congress 3 times, and I got a baptism by fire as to how it works. They usually have what's called an October surprise, where they have opposition research that is digging up dirt on their opponent, and they wait until a week before the election before they spill the dirt on the media. And unless you've anticipated and bought media time, even if you want to respond, there's no media time to buy. So it's gone from having some lying accusations released the week before the election to crises. And you've mentioned some of these crises that could be coincidental, or they could have been manipulated or planned. Why? Because when the crisis happens, the news headlines change. And the people that it benefits those that are in power. And we saw that with Obama when there was this hurricane off New Jersey, and with Christie, and he's walking the beach, and all of a sudden people in the country see him instead of it being, the campaigning ads now, oh, well, he gets all this free airtime of making it look like he's in charge. And so you see this Machiavellian concept of creating or capitalizing on crises to consolidate control. So since they control the media, they can shape the narrative. But I can't see them having worked so hard to get control like they do now, to just let it slip out of their fingers. And I think, if they have on their party platform to kill innocent babies, what's voter fraud compared to that?
Yeah, great.
And so I do think, but on the other hand, what are the stories we love best in the Bible? They're when God's people are in hopeless situations, and God raises up little nobodies with faith and courage to stand up and to do great things. And whether it's a Moses against the most powerful military in the world, the Egyptians, or David against Goliath, or Deborah against the enemy, or whether it was Queen Esther going into the most powerful guy in the world, even when she's not supposed to. And the stories we love are when things look really bad, and God uses little people who are small in their own eyes, but big in faith and courage to turn things around. And that sort of comes back to the last point, is maybe God's allowing all this crisis to put us in a position of having to make it visible whose side we're on. Some people do evil. Some people are silent in the face of evil, and by their silence, they're giving consent to it. And others are like, I can't be silent anymore. I've got to stand up, whether we turn around or not. I'm going to show everybody that I'm on the Lord's side.
Amen. Bill, it was great having you join me today. I have like 50 more questions that we never even got to. We just started getting warmed up. I need to have like a three-hour program with you or something. But people can get a hold of you through the American Minute, or what's the best way for people to get a hold of you?
Right, AmericanMinute.com.
AmericanMinute.com. And several books you have out, the one on socialism that I had mentioned earlier. Also, this one book that's a bestseller, America's God and Country, a Encyclopedia on Quotations. You have several books that are out. I wish I could say that they're in our store. I don't have them here yet. Next time I have to have them here. But people can go on American Minute. They can also get them on Amazon, I'm guessing.
Yes, yes. And I just want to let all the viewers know how much I respect you, Tom, and your wife, Jackie, and the tremendous work you're doing at 412 Church and all the conferences around the country and the world. You're just a great leader and doing a powerful work for such a time as this.
Thank you, Bill. You're very kind. Very kind words. Thank you very much. It's just a great time with you today. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule. Listen, everybody, God bless you. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we're going to have a great program. I have my midweek update that's coming. And then for the 2 o'clock app exclusive only, I have a comedian that's going to be on with me from the UK, or I'm going to be on with him. It's going to be on the app exclusive, hopeforourtimes.com, and on the Hope for Our Times app. So join us because we're going to be talking about the things that we talk about. God bless you, everybody. Thank you. And thank you again, Bill. God bless you, everybody.